Hi everyone, Grover from Headphones.com here, and today I'm going to be talking about the Headphones.com and Ampsandsound collaboration amplifier, the Forge. So the Forge, as you can see here, has a fairly standard set of inputs and outputs, IEC cable on the top, our RCA inputs here, high and low impedance headphone outputs here, and our volume knob down at the bottom. It's quite a heavy amplifier. Most of the weight is concentrated on the transformers over here. You can definitely feel it's got a ton of girth to it, and the chassis is built, frankly, like a tank. It's extremely tough, extremely durable. All of Justin's amplifiers have that similar awesome tank-like build. This one is probably one of my favorites because it uses black all the way around instead of any wood siding, and it just has a very, very sturdy feel to it. Also, as you may have seen, this amplifier uses EL34, KT88, or 6L6 type tubes, and the input tube is a 6SL7. Now I'd like to talk about some of the technology going into the Ampsandsound Forge. One of the interesting things about Justin Weber's design philosophy is that he believes in triode strapping. Triode strapping is when you take a tube which has a higher output than a typical triode, something like a pentode or a beam tetrode, and you strap it or connect the pins as if it were a triode. One of the benefits of triode strapping is that you can have more power output from a tube like a pentode or a beam tetrode, but you can have the transfer curve of a triode, which yields a very pleasing, smooth sound. Two of the other interesting things about this amp are the power supply, which is quite large and has excellent filtering, so it can supply quite a bit of current compared to your typical tube amplifier, and the output transformers. Now, Justin has told me extensively about Ampsandsound's output transformers. This is proprietary technology, and these are really interesting transformers. The science of building transformers is sort of a dark art. It's a very, very complicated science, and there's not too many people who know how to actually build really, really excellent sounding output transformers anymore. Justin has spent extensive amounts of time and energy building his own, testing his own, and listening to his own output transformers to get them to perform very well. Typically, we associate classic tube amplifiers that have output transformers as being somewhat colored sounding. This isn't the case with the Forge, however. The output transformers that Justin has worked so hard on have very wide bandwidth out high into the treble and don't really have a lot of roll-off. They don't scrub off a ton of treble, and they can deliver large amounts of current and power, a bit atypical for what you might expect for a headphone amplifier like this. Two of my favorite headphone combinations with the Forge were the ZMF Verite Openback, which off of the 300 ohm tap sounded extremely detailed, very huge, very fast, and with a great, wonderful, enveloping warm sound. And the other one was the LCD X 2021 with leather-free ear pads. This one surprised me more than almost any of the other headphones in my stable because it was very dynamic, very fast, very punchy, and it actually had very resolving treble. It took away some of the harshness that I typically associate with the upper range in this headphone, and it did it in a very, very graceful way, and it smoothed the headphone out a lot. It just sounded really, really lush and warm, but it still sounded tight without too much coloration, too much tube coloration to it. Tyler has also mentioned that he really likes the combination of the Alex Rawson RAD0 with this amplifier, though I haven't got the chance to try that combination out yet. Other honorable mentions are that the Forge was able to drive my Ether 2s without any problem and sounding very, very good. In terms of what the Forge sounds like, I would say generally it's very, very transparent. There's maybe a slight laid backness or depth to the upper mid-range, but I find it to be actually very transparent, not just for a tube amp, but for an amp in general. The low end seems to sort of glue itself to the signal in the way that tube amps do. It's a very organic bass, but it hits a lot harder than typically I associate with a tube amp, even with a very good transformer. Off of the low impedance tap, you get very tight, very punchy bass, and it will drive planers excellently. This is something that's not going to leave you missing your solid-state high current amplifiers, in my opinion. Up on the high end, we have not a lot of roll-off, tons of sparkle, tons of transparency, and again, a relatively flat frequency response that actually seems to sort of embed itself into the signal and sort of organically bring out more microdynamic content. Speed was another thing that the Forge seemed to excel at. Generally, I find that amplifiers that have minimal feedback, or at least appropriate amounts of low feedback, and in the Forge's case, there's no feedback at all, are very, very fast sounding and seem to convey the sense of rhythm in classic soul records, for example, in a way that very few amplifiers do. There's just an immediacy to the tone and texture. It tells you a lot about what's going on with the rhythm, and it also tells you a lot about what's going on with the texture of instruments and brings out little details in the timbre of sounds. I tried some mixing with this amp, and I wouldn't say it's perfectly neutral enough to be a full-time mixing amplifier. However, in general, I didn't find that the balance of my mixes came out much differently compared to my solid-state amplifiers. That's a huge bonus for the Forge because it means that it's relatively neutral in its frequency response. As I mentioned, there's a slight feeling of laid-backness around 1K, 1.5K. The effect of this was that things felt very smooth in that region. I want to emphasize that this was a very mild characteristic, and it actually suited some headphones extremely well. For example, the Focal headphones, the Utopia, has a slight bump at 1K, and this really, really worked well with the very slight sort of extra depth or dip on the Forge. Now, I didn't get a chance to tube roll the input tube, which was a 6SL7 from JJ. I thought this tube sounded excellent. JJ is one of my favorite non-American tube manufacturers, and in general, I would say you don't need to roll this tube, but there are some excellent, inexpensive NOS choices if you do choose to. From my own tube stash, I also rolled some EL34s and KT77s. This tube, compared to the ones that Justin supplied, was definitely fast, transparent, and I think had the most linear frequency response. There was a wonderful open quality to the upper mid-range and treble that I really enjoyed with this tube, and the bass seemed pretty tight and the mid-range clear and clean. Between the tubes that Justin Weber of Ampsandsound provided, the 6L6GC and the KT88, my preference was for the 6L6. It seemed to have more texture, more layering to the soundstage. Sounds had a bit more macrodynamic and microdynamic contrast, and there just seemed to be more timbral information and harmonic information about what was going on. It was very involving and presented a very wide soundstage, and it just immersed me in the music in a more compelling way. The KT88, however, was no slouch, and this is going to be a great tube, I think, for a lot of headphone enthusiasts because this tube had obviously a bit more drive and a much bigger, slammier, more epic bass sound to it. If you like headphones to have tons of really dynamic bass content and a really huge, warm sound, the KT88 is going to be great. The 6L6, I think, was perhaps just a tad warmer and more diffuse sounding. In terms of the technicalities of the amplifier, one of the things that I think is going to be really compelling about the Forge is that you don't feel like you have to sacrifice the things you typically sacrifice when you move from a solid-state amplifier to a tube amplifier. As I mentioned, my inefficient planers were driven excellently by the Forge, and I didn't feel the need to reach for any of my solid-state amplifiers. This is an amplifier which can sound very linear if you use the appropriate taps. It's important also to note that for those who might be really into tube amplifiers, the Forge is not necessarily going to give you that really juicy, harmonically colored triode or directly heated triode sound that you might be used to from a lower power amp. For that, there's not really going to be a great replacement for actually indirectly or directly heated triodes. In this case, triode strapping is going to give you a little bit more of a dense texture to the sound. It's going to give you a little bit more linearity, and you're going to have more power and drive, but the triode curve obviously isn't going to be exactly as smooth and creamy as true triodes. In this case, I think that's a great choice for most headphone users because you'll get all the linearity that you enjoy with a solid-state amplifier, mostly, but you'll get the higher power output that will drive a wider variety of headphones. I have an interview coming out with Justin Weber soon where we talk about the design philosophy of this amplifier, tubes, and all sorts of interesting electrical circuit quirks. Stay tuned for that because we're going to talk a bit more about why this amplifier is special and what makes it so cool. The Forge is kind of an interesting amp for me because it represents a tube headphone amplifier which can drive a really extensive array of headphones and do so without sacrificing the linearity and the bass dynamics that I typically like about solid-state amplifiers. In fact, I would say the Forge is in some ways superior to some of the solid-state amplifiers that I have because it provides a sense of more power and more headroom in the bass than something like the SPL Fondator or the RME that I recently reviewed. I also think that the ability to roll a wide variety of tubes in this amplifier makes it really, really flexible. Add on to the fact that these are all relatively easy tube types to find and not expensive to buy, and you have an amplifier where you can roll tubes for a relatively modest sum of money. This is something that Justin from Ampsandsound has also emphasized. He doesn't want tube rolling to be an extremely expensive endeavor for the people who buy amplifiers from Ampsandsound. For me, I love the sound of classic American gear, like those old Harman Kardon amps, like Altec Lansing, like old Western Electric, things like that. And the Forge, to me, channels a lot of what makes that sound really special. Very fast, very immediate, very immersive, and with surprising amount of power and bass dynamics. As I mentioned before, Justin and I sat down and talked extensively about the Forge, about tube rolling, about classic American gear, and I think you'll find that really interesting. So stay tuned for that, because we're going to talk more about specifically what makes the Forge cool, and also about Ampsandsound's general approach to design. I will see you next time.